All right, welcome back to Beyond the Briefing. I'm really excited about today's conversation. Ari Fleischer is going to join us. Ari has been a friend and a mentor to me for years. You'll hear in the conversation, when I first came to Washington, it was after a race that I had done in 1994, and I was serving as an intern on the House tax staff. The Republicans had just taken control of Congress. Ari was the communications director of the House Ways and Means Committee, and so much of the action was going through the Ways and Means Committee. And I looked up to Ari Fleischer. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the guy. It was the coolest deal. And then obviously his trajectory went further and further up from there. And he's always been one of those guys that's always had time to make time for others as they work their way up. And even before I made it to the White House, when I first got to the RNC was in shambles back in 2011. I had just taken the job. We were bankrupt. Ari was one of the first people I called, and I said, we need to reestablish some credibility in the comm shop. And Ari was like, tell me what I can do to help. That was Ari then. And then when I got the job at the White House, during that transition, Ari and I had spoken several times where he gave me a bunch of ideas about how to revolutionize the briefing, how to handle some of the press, and what to be prepared for. And, always sort of without anything in return. He was always there with a helping hand and a kind word. He's a truly great individual. And this book that he's got out, it's called Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias. I can't say enough of how great it is. It really lays out what the current media landscape is, the problems in it, but just such great examples. And it's not just Ari's opinion. He really does a great job of laying out the facts and solid examples and studies. He did his research in so many ways. You can just, it bleeds hard work and passion. And so if you're looking for a good read to understand where we are, and I will tell you this, I mentioned this to Ari in the conversation. I've both listened to it on Audible and I've read it. If you want to see the examples, because he puts a lot of tweets, he's got some pictures and graphs and charts and things like that. If you can afford the extra $20 if you're going to be listening to it, do that, or go look. They tell you about these engagements in the Audible version, but go look at them because there's some things in there that are so illuminating. You have to see them for your own eyes. So it's a great read and also a great listen. But the graphs and the pictures and the charts and the tweets make some of the examples just pop and come alive. So without further ado, and by the way, thank you to everyone who subscribed and reviewed this thing. I love watching this podcast climb the charts, and it's because of you. So thank you so much for doing that. So much to get to, and I look forward to talking to you on Monday because so much has happened this week politically, and you know what I'm talking about. We will talk about that on Monday, and I'm sure by then we'll have that. But obviously, if you really want to get the take, Spicer & Company every night at 5 is where you can get your take. So without further ado, Ari Fleischer. All right, I want to welcome to the program Ari Fleischer. Ari, thanks for being with us. Congratulations on the new book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias.
Thank you, Sean. Great to be with you.
We're going to talk about the book, but part of the whole goal of this podcast is really, it's titled Beyond the Briefing. I want to talk a little about your career. Obviously, you were someone that I admired greatly and followed. So I want to start at the beginning of your career because I know you've talked about this in your first book. You talk about growing up in New York in a liberal household with parents, your mom in particular, that was active in politics. You go to Middlebury in Vermont, which is a fairly liberal school. I believe it's one of the NESCAC schools. For those of us in the New England world, it's a part of a group of colleges, but it's a fairly liberal arts school. And it's interesting. You go against the grain. You seem to come out of that school less liberal than when you went in. What was it that changed you?
Yeah, I think it's accurate to say, Sean, I'm the only person in the history of the state of Vermont to enter it a liberal and leave it a conservative.
But was it the teachers? What was it that did that? That's what I think is fascinating.
It was Jimmy Carter. I got there in the fall of 1978. Jimmy Carter was president, and I was raised a liberal. I got there a liberal, and I just couldn't stand Carter. I thought he kept apologizing for things around the world, that he was weak. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And then along came Ronald Reagan with his patriotism and optimism. And one of the events, boy, I'll never forget it, was a hockey game. U.S. Soviet Union, Lake Placid, 1980. And for the first time in my life, Sean, I heard people cheer for my country. Up to that point, post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, nobody cheered for America. The flag was taken down on Middlebury's campus. It still wasn't up when I was a student. And people cheered USA, USA. And I loved it. Something went off inside me that was really just marked by patriotism and love of country. And then along came Reagan, who didn't apologize for anything. It made you feel great to be an American. And I culturally changed while I was a student there. And then 6 months after I graduated, I changed parties, became a Republican, and never looked back.
It's so interesting. I went to school at Connecticut College, just obviously a little further south, and for different reasons had a very similar experience.
Yeah, I couldn't get in there.
Whatever. I've seen the college rankings, Ari. I know where Middlebury ranks in Connecticut College.
I overslept for my interview at Connecticut College. They didn't let me in.
Is that a true story?
That's a true story. I'm embarrassed to say it.
I was going to say, with all due respect, because I know where Connecticut College ranks, and it really takes oversleeping not to get in there. So it's interesting because I see so many parallels. I left Connecticut College, did my first race in Connecticut's 2nd district. You go work for a member of Congress, start climbing the ranks. You work for Senator Pete Domenici, and then you climb on board George H.W. Bush's reelection. We'll get to that in a minute. Interestingly enough, and it's interesting because I don't know why you ever would. And I hate when people bring this up, but I got to just say it because when I did that first reelection after I left Connecticut College, I worked in Connecticut's 2nd district. We lost by 21 votes. Nancy Johnson from Connecticut had been super helpful to us, and her chief of staff had said, why don't you go to Washington and wait while during the recount? I worked on the tax staff. And obviously, we had just taken back control of Congress. You were the communications director for the House Ways and Means Committee. And I literally, I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, this is the job that I was in awe because all of the big tax bills were going through. Archer was the chair, if I recall. And this was, you were sort of, the game was being played on your field. And so, I just got where was I looked at you at that moment, the 100 days are kicking off and I'm thinking, wow, this is the coolest thing in the world to have a job like that. Where is it that you kind of said, wow, I've made it? This is what I've always wanted to do, or I've sort of made it professionally. Was it there? Was it Domenici? When does Ari Fleischer say, I've made it professionally as a press communicator in Washington, D.C.?
I think it was the day I left the White House.
Really?
I think it was the moment I drove down East Street through that final barricade and onto Pennsylvania Avenue. You know it well, Sean. And when I left the White House for the final time, the weight of the world just lifted from my shoulders. And I think for the first time in my professional career, I concluded to myself, I've made it. Because you're always in the grind. You always put your head down. It's kind of like a ball hit to short. You just run with your head down. I hope you get to first. And that's what I did for my whole career. I did my best to put my head down and do my job and not think about things. I loved my career. I loved Washington. I loved starting at the bottom and working my way up. Ways and Means was fabulous. As you point out, Republicans had just taken the majority in 1994. And I got to be on the committee where it was the center of the action of policy and communications and a little politics. I loved being in the middle of it all. And then I got to go to Elizabeth Dole's campaign where she ran for president. When she dropped out, George Bush asked me to move to Austin, Texas and be his spokesman on the campaign. And then the White House. And really, when I left the White House, Sean, that was it. I just said to myself, I've climbed the top step on my ladder and I will leave Washington. I never wanted to be a Washington for life type. I set up a private sector company, mostly dealing with sports. and I love it.
Yeah.
And it was, there's still a lot of me that admires Washington, as different as it is today, as polarized and as nasty as it is. I had a great journey.
So I get asked all the time, did you dream of being the White House press secretary? And my trajectory was, I was on the Hill, as you know, and then I went to the RNC. And I always tell people the RNC guy is like being on the JV team. You get a jersey, you get invited to the party, but you're never going to be the White House person. You'll get a job at like HUD or HHS, or like they'll invite you to be part of the team. But the campaign guy, like you were on the Bush campaign, you were the spokesman there. Like those are the people that get it. When did you start thinking in your career, or did you ever think as Domenici's guy or the Ways and Means, like I'd love to be White House press secretary, or was that something you never thought was possible until you got the job?
Well, I guess two things. One, while I was at Ways and Means, and I would watch Mike McCurry, Bill Clinton's press secretary, with tremendous admiration for how well he did his job, I thought to myself, I think I'm capable of doing a job like that. I did harbor that privately, just as I watched what he did and compared it to what I did. And I watched how he did it, even though the ideology was different. I thought, my tactics are similar. I think I could do that job. But that was as far as it went, Sean.
Right.
I learned early in my career, the worst people I ever met in Washington were the people who were so ambitious, they told you what job they were gunning for. Right. And I always kind of had disdain for that, because I thought, just do your job, do it well. And if you do it well, things will happen to you. But don't go around bragging about how far you want to go and what you can do. Keep it to yourself. Like I said, when you hit that ball to short, just put your head down, run. Don't look around. Don't pump your fist. So that's my nature, I guess. So I got lucky in the fact that I got offered the job at Elizabeth Dole's campaign by a friend of mine who was a chief consultant. I got lucky because George W. Bush and Karen Hughes, Bush's communications director, noticed me while I was doing the job for Elizabeth Dole's campaign. And that's how you make it. I don't care if it's in politics, if it's in finance, if you're a school teacher. You get promoted because you put your head down and you did your job.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I have a very similar philosophy. Like I said, when I was at the RNC, that job never elevates in history to the White House. That was never my goal. And I think I'm like you. You go, and I've told people this before, if you play the game long enough, you do well, you work hard, I never applied for a job. People call you and say, hey, I saw the way you did X, you did it well. I'd like you to come talk to us about doing this. And you're right. I know plenty of the same people in Washington who are like, one day I want to be X. And I'm like, that's not the way you really should approach this. So I think it's interesting. I want to ask you an interesting question, because it came up in your other book and it was fascinating. You talk about when you were working for Dole, you wrote about her that you didn't think she was qualified to be president. Why? It was a fascinating omission that I thought you made in that book. And I want to just ask you why you brought it up. It's to your point about being honest and transparent. Like, that's just not something that normally comes up. Why did you make that point in your last book?
Well, one, if you're a staffer, you have to believe. That's what gets you through this. These jobs are grinding, they're grueling, they're wonderful. They don't pay well.
No.
But you do it because you believe in the person that you're working for and you can see them in the job. And I think Elizabeth Dole, when she ran in 1999, I think in a candid moment, she would tell you that her experience at that point had been the head of the Red Cross and the wife of a candidate, Bob Dole, and wife of a senator. And I think she would acknowledge that alone wasn't sufficient experience, particularly in that era. I mean, President Trump has shown you can become president without having government background, but he was CEO background. Now, she was the leader of the Red Cross, but I don't think it transferred over. And it was just my observation. Sean, one of the things I've tried to do, and you know this, in the way I've tweeted and covered Donald Trump on Fox News, I do my best to call the balls and strikes. And I try to do it, I hope, in a polite, respectful fashion. But I say what I think. And I think once you work at the White House, you're no longer a partisan. You're no longer in the game. You should share insights into what happens and why. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah. And I mean, look, for people who haven't, it's interesting. I will just, as a note to people who are listening, I've been both listening to your book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, on Audible, and then reading it at the same time. On the Audible version, there's the thing they say at the beginning that there's a part called enhancements. And I was like, okay, when you read the book, you get it. You really have so many great visuals in the book, tweets and articles. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but it's fascinating because I'm having two different experiences with your book, one as a listener and then one as a reader. And so I would urge people who are listening to your book to go to those enhancements, because it really, you make the case to so many of the points that you bring out about the media so well. And it's not Ari Fleischer's opinion. It's here's the facts. Here's what the media said. And I think you really, to your point that you just made, you lay that out so well in the book. I do want to go back again, just when Bush wins, what was that interaction like when he asked you to be the press secretary? Does he call you up? Do you have a conversation? Was there an interview process? Like, how did that happen where you become press secretary?
Yeah, I'll never forget it. Well, first, about a week before Election Day, we were up by 3 or 4 points over Gore. And I had been told by people on the campaign that I was going to be asked to become press secretary. So I committed a fundamental faux pas. I started to pull some of Mike McCurry's briefings and read them and see, again, what does a White House press secretary do? How do you do these things? So I started reading them. And all of a sudden, the polls started to close. And I threw out every one of those damn briefings. And I realized I jinxed it. And on Election Day, Bush calls me in the morning, and he said he was anticipating a big win, and he offered me the job as press secretary on the phone on Election Day 2000. And he hung up the phone. He said, "I'll see you at the victory party." And of course, little did any of us know, Sean, that Election Day would turn into Election 6 week day.
Right.
But he designated me to be the press secretary at that moment and on that day. And that's what launched it. From that day forward, I was prepping to be press secretary.
Well, it was interesting. You talk about prepping to be press secretary. I will say, I think unequivocally, hands down, the most defining day of the Bush presidency was 9/11. I've said this publicly before, and I'll say it again now. I think George Bush was the right president on 9/11. You were the right press secretary on 9/11. The level of calmness and information that you put out put a country dealing with a tremendous tragedy at ease. It allowed them to have the information they needed in a way that was the right tone. And I just walk me through, because again, in your book, you talk about the state of the media today. Talk about the news cycle then, the media interaction that you dealt with, and trying to communicate information that day, maybe say versus how it is today.
Yeah, great question. Back then, there was no real internet news. There was certainly no Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. None of that existed. No YouTube, no ability for the government to put out its own message. Everything went through the mainstream media. And the mainstream media back then really was ABC, NBC, CBS. Fox News was relatively important, but nowhere near as important as it is today. So it was all mainstream media. If notice now, as everybody takes it for granted, those little chyrons that are constantly running on the bottom of your screen on TV as the anchor is talking about one topic, all these chyrons about a different topic run below. That all started on September 11th. That is when the news was so overflowing. News executives realized we need to find more ways to tell the news fast. It began that day. And so every little nugget, I'll never forget when I told the press that we got a phone call, aboard Air Force One, that got routed through the Situation Room down to the PEOC, the emergency bunker under the White House, and up to Air Force One, saying Air Force One is next. When I reported that on September 12th, it just exploded as one of those chyrons on TV. And every little development, every follow-on bit of information, the CIA's conclusion that it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when the second wave would hit. Every one of those reports landed with tremendous breaking news impact in the days when breaking news actually was breaking news of a significant nature. And that was the case for days, Sean. The networks covered my briefings live. The networks didn't break for commercials for 3 or 4 days. All the cables covered the briefing live. Al Jazeera covered the briefing live. Everything was different, weighty and heavy. from that moment forward.
You know, if we fast forward a little bit, there's a lot that came out after 9/11 in terms of going into Iraq. We know a lot more now than we did then. And there's been a lot of criticism about what you and President Bush said at the time. And again, we know what the intel said then and what we know now. There's been people like Jay Carney and others that were very critical of you. How did you handle that criticism? And I know you even did like a Twitter thread in 2019 where you went out and sort of were very like, hey, this is exactly what I knew and how I knew it. And it's sort of like, I'm intrigued as to the pushback that you're getting. And is it personal? Is the criticism of you, do you take it personally, knowing that you did the best you could and you were straightforward and honest with the intelligence that we had at the time?
John, if I or anybody in the Bush administration, or actually even going back into the Clinton administration, stood at that podium and said, we're not sure if Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. That would have been a lie. Because the CIA concluded in the 90s, late 90s, under Bill Clinton, that Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological stockpiles. It was their flat out conclusion. Now, the CIA director, William Tenet, was Bill Clinton's CIA director. George Bush kept him on. So it was the same CIA director, same conclusion. And it was the same conclusion reached by Egyptian intelligence, Israeli intelligence, French intelligence. If anybody had come out in 2001 or 1999 and said, we don't think he has it, stories would have been written in the New York Times about why is the administration downplaying the threat from Saddam? Because they knew what the CIA concluded. Now, the tragedy of it was the CIA was wrong. And after it was shown that the CIA was wrong in the Rob Silverman bipartisan investigation into what took place, that's when we realized it was a massive intelligence failure. That's when we had conclusive proof it was a massive intelligence failure, set up in large part because there was a liar. And the liar was Saddam Hussein. He created a whole web of deceit, trying to fool Iran into making Iran think he had WMD as a deterrence to Iran. But of course, American intelligence and other intelligence picked up the deceit, and we believed it. So, when people say
my point is,
lied, people died, or they come after me personally, I could care less.
Okay,
that's what I'm getting at. Said and why I said it.
Right. That's the point, though, is that you were honest and straightforward with what you had, and yet people use words like that. And okay, that's interesting.
I faithfully reported to the American people that which was told to me by the CIA and to others in the administration.
Right. Okay.
That's as simple as it gets.
So when I was taking the job, you were unbelievably generous and kind with a lot of great suggestions and counsel. And one of the things that we talked about extensively was the briefing. And that gets, obviously, for a lot of people, that's what they think the White House press secretary does. And you've addressed this before. In your book, I wish I had your book, the book that you just put out when I started. You have this chart. and I'm telling people, no matter what version you get of Ari's book, you have to go see this chart. There's a company that you worked with, I think it's called Delve.
Correct.
Checked out the voter history of the people sitting in the seats, folks. If I'm not kidding, with Ari's permission, I'll post the chart, and it's. If I can, just at the beginning of the book, you talk about this great little exercise that you've done in the past where you ask classes from, I think it's Columbia Journalism School, who they voted for. But then you literally show this chart and of the voter registration. Tell me what you found, because I was blown away when I turned the page and I saw this, because I was like, why are some of these things shaded gray?
I hired an opposition research firm to pull the public records of the voter registration files for the White House press corps. It's all public. Shown by a 12-to-1 ratio, the White House press corps is Democrat to Republican. There are 49 seats in that briefing room. Only one registered Republican, John Gizzi of Newsmax. 12-to-1, Democrat to Republican. Now, the rest of those seats are held by independents, or no voter or no registration at all, which I largely consider window dressing. I think most of them still are Democratic. But why isn't it one-to-one, Sean? Why isn't that room the pinnacle of journalism, the most important place in the journalist's career? Why isn't it balanced? Why is
But
it a
there's
12-to-1
the
ratio?
reporter for the New York Times is a registered Democrat. And I was like, at least hide it. I mean, you talk about the others, the window dressing. I flipped that page and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. How stupid.
The reporter from Los Angeles Times, the reporter from Bloomberg, both reporters from NPR. And the NPR reporter, one of the NPR reporters is registered to vote in Florida, even though she lives outside Washington and in the Washington, D.C. area. I mean, it just keeps going. But why isn't it fair? And they still don't get it. They don't understand why half the country doesn't trust them. And it's because of the way they are.
So is it, since you left the podium, how much do you think that your thinking has evolved on the press, or that they have become worse?
Well, my thinking is still call the balls and strikes, describe what I see.
No. You're in other words, do you think that you've realized how much more biased they are, or
they become worse. They become worse, Sean.
Right.
Back when I was press secretary, they were overwhelmingly liberal, but they did say their job was to be objective and fair, and I think they tried to mean it.
So
now,
go ahead.
Now, because of a couple factors. First, advertising declines, just economics. They no longer have advertisers, they have subscribers. So they have to be very careful not to tick off their subscribers, which in the case of the New York Times, for example, are overwhelmingly resistance subscribers, resistance to Donald Trump. If they start to write favorable story after favorable story about Trump, they'll lose subscribers, as they did twice. Once when Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, said, send in the troops, and the other when they had a very favorable headline by Trump that talked about ending racism. They had a meltdown in the newsroom and a loss of subscribers. Right. So the economics has forced them into niches. And then Twitter's come along and they love being activists. They love having more followers. They love their CNN and MSNBC contributor contracts. They love getting praised by Hollywood actors and actresses. I mean, it's really good for their social standing. And they love it. So that technology has changed them all. But then Trump made them lose their mind. And there's no question, Sean, your former boss just made them lose any sense of objectivity, fairness, rationality. We're seeing it again now in the coverage of the raid in Mar-a-Lago. The press thinks their duty is to save the republic from the American people. Let the people be damned who vote for Trump. The press knows better.
Would you change anything about the briefing, knowing what you know now?
You know, I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that Republicans don't need the mainstream media to be successful, that we need to build our own lists. We need to build our own good social media. We need to be fun. We need to be clever, not stodgy. And we can do a lot through talk radio, through podcasts, through conservative media. Conservative media is booming. The mainstream media is largely declining. But my good government side is tempered because I'm old-fashioned enough to still believe that if you have faith in what you're doing, if you think it's right, go into the lion's den and say it. Stand up to the networks. Go tell them what you think. Now, is it a waste of time? Are there any Republican viewers? Are there any independent viewers? Very few left because we've all gone into our niches. So as a pure pragmatic issue, Republicans less and less need the mainstream media. As a good government moral measure, I still want to make my case everywhere and anywhere.
Well, you end the book with chapter 12 calling What Comes Next, and you talk about is the cure, that they need to. But I actually thought what you just said now. I mean, I feel like to some extent, if you're a conservative, you've got outlets now that you can go to that are much more open to a discussion and receptive to issues than a CNN or a New York Times. So let's just hypothetically say in this election cycle, you're being asked, should a candidate go engage in debates? Should they engage with the CNNs and the New York Times, or go do a debate where NBC wants to moderate it? What is the advice of Ari Fleischer?
Hell no. No. I mean, one of the things I have in my book is I show how the MSNBC debates for the Republican primary, they covered some debates, CNN did too, the undecided voters. The voters were Democrats. They lied. They portrayed their undecided town hall forums. Oh, no, these were Democrat debates. These were Democratic debates that MSNBC and CNN held among undecided voters. Yet several of the voters were pro Biden voters. And MSNBC and CNN hid that from their viewership. I mean, it just, they're so unfair. The questions they ask are all biased questions. If you're a Republican, look at Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. He's running without the mainstream media, and it's going to be a fascinating experiment to see if the media has changed enough. But if you can have Hugh Hewitt moderated debate, ask actually meaningful, probing questions that are on the minds of primary voters, good, fair, tough, thoughtful, primary-oriented questions, that's what you do. It's so much better for a Republican audience than silly Democratic gotcha questions, all designed to support a Democratic agenda. That's why I wrote the book, because I need to blow the whistle on the press. They're biased.
So that's the thing is, for most conservatives, they run around and they say the press is biased. You talk about original sin in the book. What's original sin?
That's the title for my first chapter. And my premise is that the people who go into journalism have an original sin, and that original sin is they're almost all cut from the same look-alike, act-alike, tweet-alike, Democratic voter, college-educated cloth. They have a diversity problem. They don't have people in their newsrooms who hunt, who own guns, who pray every day, who are pro-life. They don't have newsrooms that look like America, sound like America, or certainly register to vote like America. And so you have reporters who think the world depends on government action, on redistribution of income, on solving for global warming, on a whole left-wing agenda, as opposed to reporters who are fair, balanced, neutral, pro-capitalism, believe in the invisible hand of capitalism, how you lift people through poverty, believe that the lack of fathers is the biggest contributor to crime and drug abuse and violence. You just have such a different worldview when reporters are cut from the same cloth. And so I'm calling for conservatives, young conservatives, to go into journalism. I'm calling for journalism schools to get wise and diversify their newsroom and have more conservatives in there. Ask people when they interview, what are your favorite hobbies? If they say they love to hunt, they love to fish, let them in. You don't have anybody like that in your journalism school. Let them in. And newsrooms need to be open to conservative thought. 50-50 diversity in newsrooms. But I doubt, Sean, whether anybody will do that. If they don't do that, we're going to continue the trend of conservative media booming and growing, increasing conservative internet publications, the Federalist, the Daily Wire, the Washington Examiner, they're growing, and mainstream media declines.
Yeah. The thing I love about your book, as I said a minute ago, is that as we have these discussions with our colleagues and our friends and our family members, it's not, and we argue back and forth sometimes about, this or that, and it's very opinion-based. Your book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, lays it out. If there's examples. So if you're going back and forth with someone, you can literally show them the example. Here's what CNN did. Here's what the New York Times said. Here's the study from Pew or from Harvard's Shorenstein Center. And that's what I loved about it. It's so just data-driven, for lack of a better phrase. And so maybe it's just me because I love this stuff, but I love how you laid it out, the trajectory of the book, the facts, the accompanied tweets and graphs and everything. So it's a pleasure to read the book. It flows well. So well done. And I know in the beginning or at the end, you talk about how, the editor approached you from HarperCollins and you had initially sort of said no, but he said, when the time is right. And the time was right. I mean, this is a very timely book for what we're dealing with now, especially in light of this raid, as you brought up. So it was an absolute pleasure getting to discuss it. If you're okay with it, we end the podcast with a little rapid fire. Are you ready?
Fire away.
All right. When you travel, are you the kind of guy that arrives early or just in time?
Always 1 hour early.
Okay. How low can you let your phone battery go without getting excited?
I never let it go low.
Oh, good. I like that. How many unread emails do you currently have?
0.
Oh my God. You and Dana Perino. I think you're both I'm the only guy that has tens of thousands. If you had 48 hours to binge any show, what would it be?
Better Call Saul.
Okay. On a level of scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolutely tidy, how clean is your house?
10.
What's your least favorite chore?
Oh, gosh. Taking out the trash.
Okay. If you could have a drink with anyone, who would it be?
Probably Derek Jeter, maybe Dan Marino.
This probably goes into the second thing. Who is the coolest celebrity that you've ever met?
Pope John Paul II. He's not a celebrity, but
Well,
I'll never forget when I met him, man. That he and Ronald Reagan brought down communism and helped save the world.
that's a pretty cool one. I'll give you that one. Ari Fleischer's biggest pet peeve.
People who are late.
What's something you won't go cheap on?
Transportation.
Oh,
Hotel rooms.
Oh, wow. Good. All right, here's your last one. I did my reality TV stint. If you had to go on a reality TV show, what would it be?
I wouldn't.
Good call. All right, here's the last real quick.
I was actually invited to Family Feud, and I didn't do it.
Call me. That's the one I want. That's the one I want.
Oh, my ex-sister-in-laws are still mad at me.
Rightly so. Top 5 answers on the board. We asked 100 people. I got that down. Come on, Steve Harvey. All right, real quick. This is a little thing just to pull out we do a little pronounce thing. Do you say data or data?
Data.
Gala or gala?
Gala.
Iran or Iran?
Iran.
Caramel or caramel?
It depends if you're talking about the town or the food.
Very good. Technical on that. All right. Aunt or aunt?
Ants, for sure.
All right. That's it. Ari Fleischer, congratulations on the new book, Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias. I appreciate how generous you've been with your time, not just with your time on this podcast, but as I've told you before, you've been such a great mentor and friend, and thank you for all of that.
Sean, it's great to be with you. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. As I mentioned, I've really looked up to Ari most of my career. He's a great person, a top-notch professional, and obviously very generous with his time. And I thought some of his answers, especially at the end. I hope you guys love the rapid fire as much as I do. It's really fun to get to know somebody in terms of their personality quirks and traits and the differences. But it's funny that you heard me mention this at the end, but a while ago, this is years ago, so I assume it's still true, but Dana had told me that she always ends every day by making sure she's down to 0. So maybe this is a press secretary thing that I never knew about. We'll have to keep asking press secretaries if they get their emails down to 0, and I'm the only one that's got tens of thousands of emails unread. But in my defense, I've got a couple like random email accounts that I don't check that often, so where I get a lot of spam. So it's not that I don't check email, it's just that I don't check some of the spam ones as much as I should. Anyway, thank you for listening to this conversation. Always appreciate any feedback you have on Instagram. We have this podcast up on YouTube at my account up there, Sean Spicer. But again, review, subscribe, help put food on the table for me. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on Monday.